Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody to the webinar tonight. We'll get started now. It's a couple minutes past 8 o'clock, and if there's a few people who join in late, that's fine. I'd like to start off by, again, welcoming you. My name is Kyle Paquette. I am a mental performance consultant with Volleyball Canada, and I'm one of the authors of Trainwave Volleyball Edition. As we get started, what I'd like to recommend is, I'd like to recommend that if you have any questions or specific topics that you'd like to be addressed, please feel free to put these in the chat. I'm going to try to go to these as much as possible. I want to try to make this a little bit interactive, even though I can't see any of you. I really do want to make sure that I try to get to as many questions as possible. So start typing away, even if it's just things that you want to make sure that we get to at some point. I'll kind of constantly be looking down to see if I can incorporate any of those questions into the next 55 minutes or so. So a few messages from LP. He wanted me to make sure that I thanked you all for coming. A big part of what the OVA is trying to achieve is to create a community of coaches who are engaged and active in their development and professional development. So that's definitely something that feels is quite part of the culture of the OVA, and it's something you want to continue to build and to thrive. So thank you all for that. A second thing that he wanted me to remind you all is regarding the PD points. So everyone who's taken part in tonight's webinar will receive 1 PD point for watching this. This webinar is also going to be recorded, so you will have access to it afterwards. So without, I guess, further delay, we'll get started right into it. So again, the purpose of tonight is to discuss a little bit about Trainwave and about how it can be used and some of the content that's within it. The book itself was developed about 5 years ago, and it was an initiative to help support coaches with mental performance. I think kind of a foundation of this whole thing is we wanted to get coaches to appreciate that a big part of mental performance and mental training should be on the hands of the coaches. And with the appropriate resources, you can do a great job. You can do just as good a job as a mental performance consultant can do in some cases. So the book itself is designed to be very user-friendly, very practical. So I'm just going to share my screen right now. I have a PDF of the workbook that I'm going to open up for you. Perfect. So again, Trainwave Volleyball Edition. The book itself is divided into 5 modules. These 5 modules, the first one, creating your vision, broadly discussing goal setting, creating game plans for achieving goals, overcoming obstacles. Second module, increasing your comfort zone. This is all about understanding the value of learning through discomfort and the role that uncertainty plays in athlete development. Discomfort, resilience, the idea of embracing routine. These are all topics that will be discussed and developed through certain activities. The third module, managing your performance. This is broadly designed to help athletes better understand what their role is in their development and their performance. Module 4, exploring your stress, understanding what stress is, understanding the role it can play that is both productive and destructive to performance. And finally, supporting your confidence, all about developing confidence, understanding the roles of preparation, understanding the roles of memory, and being in the moment to be most confident. What I'd like to do is go through each module one by one, just to give you a general feel and sense of what each module looks like in terms of the activities and the specific content. And again, if there's any questions that come up throughout the presentation, I'll try to connect to those as we're on the modules. The one thing I would like to say at the start is that each module is designed with about the same structure. This structure, as you can see, each module has 3 parts to it. The first part is typically going to be the basic introductory content. Part 2 of each module is going to be when we provide some very active strategies to overcome certain performance-related issues that are relevant to the topic in question. The third part is typically going to be a summary and some real practical how-tos. At the end of every module, you see here that there's a personal reflection, and this becomes a really important part to help the athletes reflect on what they learned. Again, given the importance of reflection in learning, we want to make sure that we're constantly getting athletes to reflect. Maybe one of 2 or 3 broad themes in this entire workbook is, number one, developing self-awareness. Self-awareness is something that we do actively have to pursue. This is something that's not going to come without some deliberate effort on behalf of the athlete, but certainly on behalf of the coach who's going to be facilitating this awareness. The benefit of having awareness, it's plentiful. Perhaps no benefit is greater than understanding your strengths so you can leverage these strengths in competition. Alternatively, understanding your shortcomings and your limitations so that you can work towards improving these and turning gaps into strengths, ideally. Definitely in my experiences with high-performance athletes, and again, the focus of this is not high performance, but to draw maybe a thread or to draw a thread through the development all the way up to the high performance. We know that the athletes who have the most awareness of themselves, who are able to be open with themselves and honest with themselves and have this sense of sort of genuineness in how they approach training and how they approach competition, it's as if they have less to hide. And by having less to hide, they don't feel compelled to avoid certain emotions or to avoid certain thoughts or avoid certain interactions with coaches or teammates. So to go through the workbook a little bit, there's a nice little preface that was written by Glen Hogue, the former national team coach, discussing some of the concepts that are presented in the workbooks and how these concepts were presented and discussed and worked on with the athletes in preparation for and during the Olympics in Rio. The introduction, we decided to put this introduction together to help people, again, have a general understanding of what mental training is. I think oftentimes when we hear mental training, we have some preconceived notions of what it is, and typically in our mind, we think of things like visualization and self-talk and breathing, and of course those are part of this workbook, but definitely a lot broader than that. And again, so if you look at the middle of this page here, number one, mental training involves becoming more aware of our typical responses to situations that matter. Given that we're all guided by a brain and by a mind that are fundamentally similar in many, many ways, given that we're all human, it's very predictable how athletes, especially young athletes, are going to respond to certain stressful situations or just maybe more broadly situations that matter to them. Part two of this then becomes, once we understand our typical responses to these situations, let's work towards identifying a preferred set of responses that are aligned with our goals. At the end of the day, we're all trying to strive to achieve something. We know that there's going to be some default thoughts and default habits of emotions and default habits of actions that are going to interfere or make us achieving those goals more challenging. So in an ideal world, how would we want to respond to these stressful situations? And then it's all about mindfully training these preferred responses to help our performance. This is followed up with a few misconceptions about sports psychology. These 4 misconceptions in particular are ones that we definitely hear a lot of when we work with coaches, especially developmental level coaches or youth athletes in general. So the first one being that sports psychology interventions aren't effective. Again, there's been about 90 years of research in sports psychology. It dates back to about 1910, so it's been more than 90 years now. It's been about 100 years, 105 years since Coleman Griffith first started to look at the psychology of coaching and athlete performance. And now in the last 10 or 15 years, thanks to technological advances, we know that the brain actually is a little bit more malleable than we once thought. We know that the structure and the pathways in the brain are flexible, are malleable, and therefore we can develop new habits fairly quickly. And this can lead to improved performance. We can change the way that we think. We can change the way that we fundamentally respond to stressful situations. We know that there is a significant body of literature that shows that there's evidence for effective sports psychology interventions. And these evidence-based interventions are what guided all of the activities in these workbooks. They are all based on science. And whether or not they're evidence-based, certainly they're evidence-informed. The second misconception is that sports psychology is really only for athletes with serious problems. And again, that was a belief that was maybe held a little bit more greatly so 20, 30 years ago when sports psychology was becoming a little bit more mainstream. But the truth is sports psychology really helps everyone. The vast majority of the work that I do with all athletes, even the highest performing athletes that I work with, is about personal well-being and satisfaction and fulfillment. If we can't help an athlete to develop satisfaction for what they're doing and to increase their sense of fulfillment and the overall well-being that they get from participating and competing in sport, then I think we're missing a pretty significant part of our role and responsibilities as coaches and support staff. The third misconception is about training the mind takes too much time. That is partly true. In some ways, training the mind, depending on what we're training, can take time. However, it is a misconception in that I don't think a lot of people appreciate how there are certain mental skills, certain cognitive skills that can change rather quickly with the appropriate awareness and the appropriate reinforcement by parents, coaches, and support staff. To a large degree, we should be comparing mental skills to physical skills or motor skills, where we know that it's a matter of developing a new motor pathway. And once that pathway is developed, it's about reinforcing it. And that doesn't take as much time as we would think. The final misconception that is highlighted here is that training the mind involves listening to an expert talk. So again, this webinar is not necessarily a great example of that because it's not as interactive as I would like. But training the mind does not involve just listening. That's extremely passive. Any skill, in fact, any learning, we know based on about 100 years of research, not just in sports psychology, but in psychology and in education, that it's the person who does the work who does the learning. We know it's the person who puts in the repetitions who develop the skills. So mental skills and psychological perspective and a psychological framework is no different. We want to make sure that athletes are not taking a passive role, but rather they're assuming a very active and responsible role for their development. So to get into the first module, creating your vision. Again, the idea behind this module was to introduce the concept or maybe further develop the concept of setting goals, understanding the barriers that are going to interfere with these athletes achieving their goals, and from there, creating a game plan to manage these barriers. So part one, again, all about setting goals. Setting goals incorporates two important steps. The first step is to determine what we want to accomplish. So therefore, we have to understand what it is we want to achieve, the performance that will lead to this achievement, and the ways we need to think and act to make sure that this performance is possible. Again, goal setting, I think oftentimes when we think of goal setting, we think of SMART goals. And again, there is quite a body of literature that speaks of the benefits of SMART goals, but we were looking to present it in a way that was a little bit more innovative, a little different, so glazed over by the athletes. A big this again is to understand that it's a responsibility to strive, to act and think in ways that are aligned with our goals. Goal setting is not enough. We have to understand what type of actions and what type of thoughts are aligned with our goals. Once we can identify what those actions are, that becomes a matter of being accountable to those actions. accountable to those thoughts and having somebody to positively reinforce these actions and to positively reinforce these thoughts. One of the messages that you're probably already hearing, maybe it's been repetitive a little bit, but this idea of positive reinforcement, I can't stress that enough. A huge part of the work that I do with any athlete, but especially in volleyball when I'm in the gym with the national team coaches and athletes, I would say upwards of 80% of the work that I'm doing is positively reinforcing actions, thoughts, and emotional responses that are aligned with the goals of the athletes and that are aligned with the goals of the coaches. So this is not just athletes I'm talking about. In my case, I'm also looking for the actions and thoughts and the emotional responses that I see in coaches to make sure that I'm positively reinforcing those. Again, we know, based on a pretty critical body of research, that positive reinforcement is much more impactful and effective than negative reinforcement. In fact, there's very little evidence to support the long-term impact of negative reinforcement. If you think of it in two ways, I use often the analogy of the stick or the carrot. And although the stick is our default response, when we see something that creates an emotional response in us, we typically respond emotionally. So for example, a group of athletes is doing something that we don't like, so right away we tell them not to do that. We negatively reinforce those actions. The problem is we're actually putting energy and putting focus on those negative actions or those negative habits. Instead, what we want to be doing is we want to shift the focus and the attention of the athletes on the habits that we're trying to reinforce. And then once we see even just a little nugget of those, then we want to make sure that we're constantly positively reinforcing those. Again, this goes against a little bit of our default though. This is a bit of a training for the coaches and a training for the support staff to understand that in the long run, the more we use negative reinforcement, the more we're creating habits of avoidance in the athletes. So there's only two ways athletes can operate. They can either be striving or pursuing something, or they can be avoiding something. So we can either be walking towards goals that we're trying to achieve, skills we're trying to learn, habits we're trying to develop, or we're moving away from the bad habits we're trying to avoid, or the losses or failure or discomfort that we're trying to avoid. These habits that we develop in athletes at a young age are critical to how they're going to not only continue their development, but how they're going to respond to certain situations of stress or certain situations that matter. If an athlete's default response has been conditioned in them to avoid failure, to avoid misses, you can imagine how they're going to respond when they have the ball in their hands on the service line for the win. Even though logically and rationally, we know that they should be using that opportunity as, in fact, an opportunity for success, but all they're going to be thinking about is, I need to avoid making this mistake, and then we can quickly appreciate what that's going to do to their performance. This also has significant implications to training. The more that we create athletes that are avoiding doing the wrong things, the more that their attention is fundamentally going to be placed on these things that they're trying to avoid, rather than on the skills, the patterns, the habits, and the responses that we want them to develop. So once we get them to identify the goals, and once we have the athletes identify the actions and the thoughts that are congruent with these goals, then it's about getting them to create a game plan. So the game plan is, well, how are you going to go about achieving these goals? What are you going to do on a daily, weekly, a monthly basis? And we wanted to make sure that we had the athletes to understand the importance of the different pillars of performance. So down here on the page 22, you can see we talk about the technical, tactical, physical, mental, and social. These 5 pillars of performance come up repeatedly in the workbook, getting athletes to think of all layers of their performance, not just the physical, technical, tactical. We really want them to also think about, again, how are they going to approach this from a mental perspective, but also what are the social implications, or how even does the social environment influence their likelihood of achieving these goals. Part 3 is, once this game plan is in place, well, let's identify the obstacles that could interfere with us achieving these goals. And again, more practically, if we kind of step away from the workbook for a second, it's important to appreciate that on a day-by-day basis, we have probably hundreds of competing goals that are often unconscious to us. But if we actually sat down and took a moment to say, okay, what are all the goals that I'm trying to achieve today? Even the most basic ones. Well, I'm trying to stay alive, therefore I need to eat. I need to stay hydrated. I need to get oxygen. I need to go to work. I need to make money. I probably need to stay active. I need to stay fit. I want to keep my social life active. I need to nurture certain relationships. I probably want to be a good father, a good wife, a good husband, good daughter. All of these goals require energy. They require resources that are limited. They require our attention. So what we need to do is we need to prioritize these goals. We need to appreciate that at some moments, some of these goals can get the bulk of our resources while others are deprioritized, and vice versa. At other moments, we're going to focus our efforts on other goals, but we're also, by doing so, we have to appreciate that we're deprioritizing other goals. Before each personal reflection, you're going to see this little quick guide. The idea behind this quick guide is the summary of the module. So we created these ideally as these little kind of quick hits for coaches to use. We encourage you to photocopy these and to bring these to practice, or to have these on a clipboard. So it's kind of like a little bit of a, almost like a cheat sheet for what the module is all about. Each one of these quick guides are divided into 3 parts. So again, here, the setting goals, creating a game plan, overcoming the obstacles, and they're broken down into 2 parts. So what are the kind of the quick hits? What do we need to know about each one of these parts? And what are the to-dos for each one of these parts? These are often the pages that the athletes will refer back to when they're looking for some strategies or solutions to some of the performance-related issues that they're dealing with. The personal reflections, they all have the same structure. So again, the purpose here is to get the athletes to reflect on how they can apply the knowledge that they've gained of this module or the specific topic in question, both in life but also in volleyball. And if they have any additional questions, they're encouraged to fill this out. And those personal reflections, in our experiences, are best served when they either take a picture of them and send them to the coach via text message, or whether you have some sort of online platform like a Facebook page, or whether you have some sort of app like a Slack account or a WhatsApp account where you can just post these and the athletes can submit these to you as they get them. The key to these personal reflections is that you really want to have an understanding of where the athletes are at with their progress through the workbook. An important concept in learning is called the representation of learning. If you want to know how much somebody knows about something, you simply ask them to represent what they know. And the complexity, or I would say the depth of their ability to represent it, is going to give you a really good indication of how much they took from it. So for example, in this personal reflection, if they provide you with 2 words, that's going to tell you one of 2 things. One is they didn't really care about the activity and they didn't take much time, or 2, that's the depth of the knowledge or of the learning that they gathered. So over time, what we see is by constantly encouraging and positively reinforcing more depth in the representation of athletes learning, the more that you're actually helping them to further develop and further learn and further consolidate information. Moving on to the second module, increasing your comfort zone. So the first part of this is to understand that the essence of learning requires disjuncture or dissonance, or a break in an individual's harmony, state of harmony. We need to not know something and to recognize that we don't know something in order to learn. This idea of discomfort, therefore, represents that dissonance, this moment in time where we can no longer take our situation for granted. We can't be on autopilot. We need to actually stop and process what's going on. And we need, this presents us with a moment to learn. With athletes that are the age that you're dealing with, this moment where they can no longer take their world for granted and they have to stop and get off of autopilot, that's a moment that's going to be really uncomfortable. And athletes have learned certain responses to these moments. And oftentimes it's either to ignore them. That's the easiest one. well, I don't really need to know this. I'm just going to change what I'm doing. Denial is another one. No, I'm all good. I'm going to keep doing the way I'm normally doing it, even though I know it's likely not going to be in my best interest. We need to help athletes to learn that this not knowing is actually critical to their development. Now, again, I'm confident in my experiences with coaches in many sports. They all know this, and I'm not telling you anything new. But if I could really hit home something, is to constantly be reinforcing this fact. And by constantly, I do it every day. Every time I work with any athlete of any age level, or any age or skill level, I am constantly positively reinforcing anytime they ask any questions, anytime they present any curiosity, anytime they're willing to present any type of alternative perspective to the conversation, anytime that they make note of not knowing something. This is always a moment that I take to reinforce, because the more that we can have athletes deliberately develop this curiosity and deliberately develop a fundamental understanding that not knowing is their pathway for learning and continued skill development, the more that we are going to help them to accelerate their learning and therefore their development. So part 2 of this module becomes seeking discomfort. Once we help the athletes to develop an understanding of the importance of seeking discomfort, then we actually help them to identify strategies. There's a variety of strategies. Strategy number 1, as per activity 4, is to identify weaknesses and failures. Oftentimes, we avoid reflecting on weaknesses, or identifying weaknesses rather, and reflecting on failures. This is inherently uncomfortable, but again, there's a tremendous amount of learning and a tremendous amount of growth that we can achieve by virtue of doing this. So this activity in particular has the athletes reflect on, again, these 5 pillars of performance: technical, physical, tactical, mental, and social, and to identify a very specific weakness or gap in their performance or their development, and then a plan of action of how they're going to go about overcoming that or managing it. Another way to seek discomfort is to celebrate strengths and successes. Again, in my experiences, more so with I would say adolescent girls than boys, they typically have a hard time, first of all, taking a compliment, but celebrating their strengths or successes. They often try to avoid those. That creates discomfort in and of itself. So again, that's the purpose of the activity, is to get them to say, well, no, if you're trying to pursue something, if you're striving for a goal, if you're striving for success, we want to make sure that you have a really good understanding of what you're good at so we can leverage that. We also want you to be very mindful of the successes you've achieved, even the smallest of successes, and this is for a variety of reasons. Reflecting on successes, we know it's going to help to build confidence and belief. That's one thing, but that's a real minor one. Perhaps more importantly, it's going to incrementally increase an athlete's satisfaction and fulfillment with their performance. This is really where the magic comes. If some of you heard me speak at the OVA Coaches Conference last March or April, I believe, you would have heard me speak about the 3 master pathways of performance, fulfillment, and satisfaction. Those 3 master pathways are gratitude, compassion, and awe. We know the more that athletes can reflect on their successes and reflect on their strengths and be grateful for these moments, be grateful for the opportunities they have, we know that this is going to increase their fulfillment. We know this is going to make for more satisfied performers and therefore higher quality performers in the end. Part 3 is about embracing routines. So one of the ways to increase our comfort zone is to appreciate that a comfort zone in and of itself is something that has a tremendous amount of familiarity. And that's where routine comes in play. The only inherent reason for developing routines. I think, first of all, I should say, I believe that routines, performance routines in general, are a little bit misunderstood in sport. I think sometimes coaches believe that by virtue of doing the same thing over and over and over again, that it's going to help with the outcome of the performance of the athlete. And I guess in a kind of a roundabout way it may. But routines all about two things. Number one is developing comfort. In a situation, in a moment that matters, we know that an athlete is going to feel uncomfortable. We know that to be true because it's going to matter to them. We know it's going to conjure up emotions of anxiety or fear or frustration. So we need to find a way to get them to feel as comfortable as possible, as familiar as possible. And that familiarity comes in engaging in actions and conjuring up thoughts that are familiar. The second reason routines are so important is because it does increase the probability of an athlete kicking into sort of an automaticity mode of their performance, where again, we're trying to get them to be more automatic so that they can perform in sort of a reactive, instinctive, habitual way. That habit sometimes gets hijacked by our conscious attention of what's happening around us. Our mind gets pulled away from the tasks. One of the ways to overcome that is to get athletes to put their focus on certain familiar behaviors, and by virtue of doing that, that could kick them into some sort of automatic mode to help them to be more engaged automatically with the task. So for us, there's a few important routines. There's this before performance routine, on-court routine, and then after performance routine. Each one of these three routines is going to be elaborated on in Module 4. This is a bit of a way just to get them to start to think about what are the things I probably have to start doing a little bit more regularly before I compete to give myself the best chance at enhancing my performance. What are some of the things I have to do on court and then afterwards to either recover physically or mentally, or to learn from my successes or my failures, and to best prepare for the next match. Again, at the end of this module, there's a quick guide, a few notes, things to know, and again, a few things to do, and that's followed up by a personal reflection. Moving on to Module 3, managing your performance. Part one of managing your performance is first of all developing an understanding of what is within your control and what is outside of your control. And again, this is nothing new. This has been around the world of performance psychology, or just performance in general, for many decades. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is we're trying to achieve a goal, as per what I said at the start of this. Once the goal is established, we have to understand what tasks do I need to complete to achieve that goal. So it's like I have this goal in the distance. What are all the stepping stones that I need to reach, or do I need to accomplish to get to that goal? And then once those stepping stones are developed, okay, great. What do I need to do to accomplish these stepping stones, to overcome these stepping stones? And then how well can I keep my focus and my attention on the task at hand so that the likelihood of me achieving these milestones, or maybe crossing these stepping stones and moving towards my goal, is more likely. And that does require taking control, taking action when you can, and avoiding to take action, or avoiding to attempt to take action on things that are outside of your control. That's the definition of ceaseless striving. When we continue to act on something that is fundamentally out of our control, it's a waste of resources. It's a waste of our time. It's a waste of our energy. It's a waste of our attention. And again, these resources that I'm referring to are extremely valuable in the context of athlete development, in the context of performance, well-being, satisfaction. We need to protect these resources. And as coaches and as support staff, it's our responsibility to help to ensure that our athletes understand the value of these resources and how to allocate them appropriately. Once the athletes get a better understanding of what's within and what's outside of their control, we get them thinking about emotions. Again, emotions is another area, another concept that is often misunderstood. We don't do, in general, emotions aren't well understood in our society. We often hear, we see words like emotional control, controlling our emotions. We can't control our emotions. We have to appreciate, in general, whether it's emotions or thoughts, being human involves a tremendous amount of variance. There's a significant degree of human variability that we need to understand, that we need to have our athletes understand. Our emotions, just by virtue of being human, we are going to experience a cascade of emotions every day. Just by virtue of being human, we are going to experience a tremendous amount of thoughts that vary from being productive to destructive. Just by virtue of being human, there's going to be a tremendous variability in our physiology, in our energy levels. We need to understand that being human means that we, on a daily basis, there's going to be this up and down in our thoughts, up and down in our emotions, up and down in our physiology, and even an up and down in our performance. Even the best performers in the world, there's going to be a natural performance distribution, where part of their performances are going to be on the low side of their potential, and part of their performance is going to be on the upside of their potential. It's very hard to be predictive of what performance an athlete's going to achieve, but also what emotions or thoughts an athlete's going to feel or going to experience, and then in turn to understand the impact that these thoughts or emotions are going to have. I think, without getting too far on a tangent here, I think it's just really important to understand that we often will refer to things as being good or bad or positive or negative. And you're going to notice going through this workbook that those words are not in here. They're nowhere to be found, because nothing is inherently good or bad. Nothing is inherently positive or negative. There are no emotions or thoughts or actions that are inherently positive or negative when it comes to sport performance or performance in general. Instead, there are certain thoughts and emotions that are going to be productive in certain moments, and they're going to be destructive in certain moments. Alternatively, there's going to be certain symptoms of emotions that are either going to be helpful or harmful to us staying on task and achieving our goal. But once we can help athletes understand, again, that there's no good or bad emotions, there's no good or bad thoughts, they have a tendency to stop trying to avoid certain emotions, or to stop trying to avoid or suppress certain thoughts. We don't want any suppression of thoughts. We don't want any suppression of emotions. We want people to be extremely genuine. Again, in all of my work with athletes, a major theme is genuineness. If you are feeling angry, be angry. But just understand that there are certain symptoms of anger that could take you away from the task at hand, whether the task is developing or whether the task is performing. If you are anxious, don't pretend like you're not. Be anxious, but have also an understanding, an awareness of self, of when you are anxious. Here are the thoughts and here are the actions that typically are symptoms of anxiety that take me away from the task at hand. There's nothing that we can say or do that is going to eliminate or control emotion. And I just want to make sure that's very clear. Just like there's nothing that we can say or that we can do that is going to eliminate a intrusive thought. We can soften an emotional response, and we can certainly soften the impact of an intrusive thought, or maybe decrease its persistence or likelihood of returning. But we can't fundamentally change our response to a high performance situation. Our instinctual response, let me be specific. We can, however, change how we respond to that instinctual response. And that is where psychological training or mental training comes in handy. Part 3 of this module is to help the athletes to discover their unique path to success. So in a previous version of the workbook, this was referred to as a recipe for success, but we've changed it a little bit because in fact it is a path. It's not a recipe. It's a little bit more complex. It requires a little bit more of careful navigation to understand the obstacles and the challenges and the pitfalls that lie ahead, and to then pave the way around or through these challenges. Moving on to the 4th module, exploring your stress. So again, another big part of this is to, again, dispel this notion of stress being bad. Stress is not inherently bad. Stress is actually, in many situations, very helpful. Without stress, we wouldn't likely complete assignments on time. We wouldn't likely get to work on time. If we didn't have any stress, we wouldn't be motivated to do much of what we do in a day-by-day basis. So this module is all about having athletes to reflect on some of their preconceived notions about stress, some of the situations that they would have, without much thought, labeled as being negative or labeled as being harmful, and to get them to just question that. Is it actually harmful? Does it have to be harmful? Is there any way in which they could be helpful? And if so, what can we do to nurture that? As a quick, just to go back up here for 1 second, there's some really interesting research and science on this, where if let's say, for example, I'm working with a national team player on serving, and we asked this player to serve 20 times. We know what's likely going to happen. We know that the first handful of serves, the first, let's say, I don't know, 4 to 6, the performance is going to be a little loose. It won't be as consistent, and it won't be as high of standards. And then after the first 4 or 6, they're going to get into it. They're going to get a little bit more engaged because of kind of the practice effect, and because of their ability to refine and make corrections to what they're doing. Their performance is going to get more consistent, and it is going to get to a higher level. But over time, what is going to happen is by the last 5, 6, 7 serves, that performance again is going to drop. It's going to lose its consistency because of complacency, because there's no stress, there's no press to be better at what they're doing. And this is just a connection to this idea of stress is not always harmful. In many situations, it's helpful. The stress of wanting to perform and wanting to develop skill is going to provide the fuel and the drive for people to pursue challenging situations. Now, there's 2 sides to this coin, though. Even though stress is not inherently bad, stress at some level is going to tax the body. At some level, it's going to use up some of those valuable resources we spoke of. So we need to help athletes understand this and understand how they're going to refuel, how they're going to take their foot off the gas in moments where they don't need to be going pedal to the metal. One of these activities is simple breathing. Another one is mindful meditation. Meditation is an activity, as some of you might have heard me share in the past, is an activity that every one of the athletes I work with, they do some form of mindfulness meditation. They have some form of practice that they do either in and around training and competition, or on their own time at home. And simply put, mindfulness is really the skill that allows us to monitor the thoughts and monitor the emotions that we're feeling in a given moment. This is the tool that allows us to recognize whether, in fact, the emotions we're feeling, if the symptoms of those emotions are harming our thoughts and harming our actions. It allows us to more quickly course correct. It allows us to more quickly identify whether what we're doing is congruent with what we want to achieve. And the last part is taking time to check in, having athletes identify their activation levels. So we put this thermometer here, and I quite like this thermometer because it's a nice visual to help athletes understand that there are, again, advantages and disadvantages for different levels of activation. Oftentimes athletes think, oh, I need to be super pumped up, and being super pumped up, there's only advantages. Well, sure, there's advantages. As for the diagram here, it enables short-term bursts of energy and power and quicker reactions, and it may help intensify focus on specific areas. It might even improve motivation to persist on a task. However, there's also common disadvantages that are common to all humans. Increased levels of activation, it narrows our attention. So, for example, for a middle who's trying to block, their attentional field is going to be more narrow when they're highly activated. That's going to decrease their likelihood of reading the play and understanding where they need to move. It's also going to limit their awareness and ability to efficiently shift their attention. So not only is their attention going to be more narrow, they're not going to have as much control of it as they did when they're a little less activated. And finally, it consumes a lot of energy. So it consumes a lot of fuel. There's not a lot of sustainability there. So if you're playing 3-4 games in 2 days, the likelihood that the performance is going to be high in games 3 and 4, it's extremely low. Now, alternatively, low activation, when we think of people who are a little bit more calm and relaxed, in some situations we think, well, there's a lot of advantages to that, and there certainly is. These athletes are unlikely to be tense and nervous. Not a lot of energy is being used, so they could really go for a long period of time without seeing any real decline in their attention, any real decline in their performance, any real decline in their learning or development. And this idea of using sort of finesse shots or delicate shots or touch and feel is enhanced with low activation. However, the disadvantages, well, one is they're likely not going to be fully engaged in a task or in a moment. And if they are, that's not likely going to be sustainable, because unlike being highly activated where the attention narrows, being very low activation or having low activation is going to create this broad attention that's going to be kind of jumping everywhere, more likelihoods of being distracted, and therefore they might miss important details. So the idea is to have the athletes identify at what level feels best for them, and do they have evidence to support that? Is there moments in practice where we know that they have been in their kind of optimal learning zone? Or in competition, have they been in moments of optimal performance with certain levels of activation? And if so, that's great, but we also have to show them the opposite side of that coin, which is on one side, we know that this is optimal for you, but on the other side, we just have to be protective or cautious of some of the disadvantages of being in this certain range. I quite like this activity 9, the idea of creating a what-if game plan. So the what-ifs is, well, what if I'm overactivated the night before? What if we're getting ready for provincials and I'm feeling really nervous? I'm pretty stressed out. My internal activation level is much too high for me to go to sleep. What do I need to do? And then immediately before performance, what if I'm overactivated or underactivated? And then on court, mid-rally, between points, between sets, how am I going to manage my activation to ensure that I'm in the range that is going to give me the best chance at engaging in the actions, engaging in the thoughts that I need to stay on task and to perform to my potential? And then finally is supporting your confidence. A big part of supporting confidence is to understand that preparation is really one of the most critical elements of confidence. The more that we can reflect on the preparation that we have done and the evidence of improvement or of progress, the more we are going to feel confident. Also, recognizing the preparation of our teammates. Given the importance of teamwork and team-based skills, there's a certain energy about a team that is confident in the team itself and the team's probability of success. Memory plays also a really important role, understanding how emotions can lead to memory storage and how that storage of memory can pop up in critical moments. And then finally, this quote, I think, it really does highlight the essence of this module, which is that what we're trying to help athletes, and I would say just adolescents, develop is this idea of unconditional confidence. And unconditional confidence is a confidence that comes without condition. If I'm playing good, if I'm playing bad, if my last skill was successful or if it was unsuccessful, regardless of what's happening, I am going to be confident in what I can do moving forward, because unconditional confidence comes from having a realistic sense of your abilities and imperfections as a performer. We need athletes to appreciate their imperfections, understand the limitations of their performance. The point is not to daydream and to visualize success and see themselves on the podium and to only see themselves succeeding with their skills and making good plays. And we're not trying to create unrealistic people here. We're trying to get people to appreciate that there are certain limitations to their skill sets and they have certain imperfections as humans. Let's understand what these are. Let's become very aware of these and the impact that these have on our performance. So when they happen, it's not surprising. And moreover, we can accept them more quickly. I'm just going to skip through here to get down to the final part here. At the very end of the workbook, what we did is we put together a performance plan. And the idea of this, again, is we encourage athletes and coaches to make as many photocopies of these as possible, but on a daily or weekly basis as a way to continue to get the athletes to engage in the workbook, is to have them reflect on how they're going to use each one of these modules in training or in competition. And this has really proven to be really successful with the athletes who have worked with the workbook to date. We have a curling version of this, so we've had a lot of experience with this. And literally prior to practice or prior to a competition, the coaches will have the athletes fill in this page. So for example, what's my objective for today's performance? What will I do to increase my comfort zone? To help control my performance, I'm going to focus on the following actions and thoughts. To help me enter a helpful performance state, I will do the following. If my level of activation gets too high at any point, here's what I'll do. And I will do the following to support my confidence. This becomes really their performance plan. And I say performance and not just mental performance, because at the end of the day, the answers to these questions are in fact going to likely bleed into these 5 pillars of performance that we speak of throughout the entire workbook. So I'm going to stop there. And I really open the floor up to questions here. So at this time, I want you to start to type furiously and get your questions in if you have questions. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to type these questions. And as you do, I'm just going to quickly run through maybe just some of the mechanical issues of delivering this workbook. So again, you start typing as I continue on for the next 2 minutes. In the past, what's worked best for teams and clubs who have integrated this into their training is that they'll complete a module about every month. Therefore, they're going to complete one of 3 parts of the module every week and a half to 2 weeks. This is going to create about a 5.5 month program. My apologies. So again, 1 module per month. 1 part of each module every week to 10 days, and that will create about a 5.5 month program. At the end of that 5.5 month program, this is going to bring you really close to provincials, which is a really great time to, again, have them become really comfortable with this performance plan, have them become comfortable understanding where their attention is going to be, what their goals are, and how they're going to manage any of the interference that they're going to experience. I can't stress this enough. The athletes who have taken the most out of this workbook have two things in common. Number one, they are really engaged in the activities. So the athletes who get the most out of this are definitely the ones who put the most into it. And number two, the athletes in the past who have typically gotten the most out of this workbook are also the ones with the coaches who are most actively engaged with the workbook. And again, this is not to put any pressure or emphasis necessarily on the role that you play, but as you know, a coach's role is largely indicative of an athlete's likelihood of development and performance. So your role is important when it comes to this workbook. The more that you can integrate some of the language into your practices, the more that you can even find a way to integrate maybe the completion of certain activities into your practices and competitions. There's a lot of downtime in competitions where athletes would definitely benefit from sitting down and getting their mind off of where it's likely going to go in competition and put it to something a little bit more productive. So I'm going to pause right there. I'm going to read one of the questions here from Jason Marchand. What do you find important and how do you recommend, what do you find important and how do you recommend us as coaches interact with athletes and this resource? Do the activities together or do them individually and then meet as a team? So I would say that in an ideal world, I'll start with an ideal world. In an ideal world, you'd probably do 1 to 2 activities together per week. This would show them, and I would do it in the gym. I would try to get them to understand that doing these activities and reflecting on these activities can happen in the gym. We don't want to just distinguish mental training is for home and other performances is for the gym. That creates a really poor understanding of mental performance. We can't take away mental performance from performance per se. And again, I challenge you all to understand mental performance with a little bit of a broader lens. Any type of thinking, decision-making, processing, reactionary skills, communication, connecting with teammates, listening to coaching, processing information, developing motor skills, this all falls underneath that broad category of psychological skills. So the more that you could be using the language and doing the activities together, the best. Now that being said, even in an ideal world, I do suggest that if a couple activities are done together during practice, that means that there probably still are about maybe 60% of the activities that are done at home and on their own. Jean-Claude wrote, are there any modules that have been approached differently depending on the age of athletes, 13U versus 18U? So the answer is no. What does change though, this is a really important point. The content doesn't change. It's the degree of reflection and the sophistication of the answers that the athletes will give you. So for example, I encourage you to complete the workbook. And I say that knowing that I've completed the workbook a couple times. And what's interesting is the more sophisticated you are and the more experiences you've been through and the more that you have on your plate, that is representative in the answers that you give. So for example, a simple question like, what are some of the challenges? What are your goals? Well, for a 13-year-old, their goal might be to make the starting lineup. Well, as adults, when you complete it, your goal is going to be just more sophisticated. Maybe it's going to be to ensure a positive experience for all the athletes that coach. Well, great, that's pretty intense. What are all the challenges that are going to come up to that? Woof, there's a lot of challenges. You start to see really quickly that just by virtue of being more mature and more sophisticated in your thinking, the same questions are going to take on a completely different meaning depending on the maturity of the individual completing them. Glen wrote, with the head coaches already inundated with other duties, is this workbook something that assistants ought to take up as part of their coaching development? So I'm going to say this, and I know we're at 9 o'clock here. I'm more than happy to go for another 5 or 6 minutes. I just want to respect and appreciate everybody's time here. So if you do have to leave, I really do appreciate, first of all, your support for the resource. That's first and foremost. I also appreciate your interest in supporting this a part of your athletes' training and development. So to go back to Len's question, what I will say is this. We know that in education, in psychology, in sport coaching, in certain types of therapies, we know that the impact of an intervention, of any intervention, a coaching intervention, a teaching intervention, a psychological intervention, a physical therapy intervention, we know that the effect of an intervention is more predicted by the individual delivering the intervention than the intervention itself, than the quality of the intervention. That means you can have something that is evidence-based. You know that if you do this, it's going to lead to a certain outcome. The vast majority of the effect of that intervention, though, is going to be dependent on you, the coach. The reason I go here is by saying that it would be really easy for head coaches to say, this goes above and beyond my responsibilities. Every coach I work with, and I'm challenging with every national team coach that I'm currently working with, I believe that it is of central importance that a coach develops a really meaningful interpersonal relationship with every athlete they work with. I believe it is critical for every coach to be impactful, to have a very clear understanding of the individuality of every athlete, what types of thoughts and emotions that they're experiencing, so that you can shape your efforts, your coaching strategies. You can tailor your approach to each athlete in a way that is more likely going to connect with them in a meaningful and relevant way. Having impact on an athlete, at the center of that is to understand that individual, to understand what challenges they experience, to understand what obstacles they believe are prevalent in their life, to understand how they see the world and the lens through which they understand sport. They see your interventions and how they're responding to your efforts. So that's a very long-winded way of saying assistant coaches, absolutely fill your boots. However, head coaches, I would strongly encourage you to reflect on, if you're not consistently and deliberately integrating these messages into what you do, I would get you to question where you're putting your time and energy. Going back to Jason Marchand, how would you approach using this year over year? So athletes go through it in 14U. Would you do anything different in their 15U season or year over year as they go through 13U to 18U? Again, great question. That's something that we've had to deal with for the last 3-4 years in different sports, and even in volleyball. We've had a few clubs who have been long-time users of this. The answers, there's two answers to this. I would say the most important part of the answer is that mental training, psychological training, is very similar in many ways to technical training, tactical training, and physical training. And what I mean by that is, with physical training, the activities and exercises don't change much from a 14-year-old to an 18-year-old, or from an 18-year-old to a 23-year-old, or from a 23-year-old to a 27-year-old national team athlete. The technical drills and tactical drills don't change much from a 16-year-old to a 19-year-old. Sure, there's going to be some nuances, and sure, the complexity might change or enhance a little bit. Mental training is no different. The questions don't change. We do. Our understanding of ourselves change. Our awareness of ourselves change. Our habits change. Our tendencies change. Our strengths and weaknesses change. So the answer to this is these activities become just as meaningful year after year as long as we can find a way to get athletes to continue to honestly look inside and to be comfortable enough completing the activity over. We would ask a 13-year-old to do a push-up. We would ask an 18-year-old to do a push-up. We would ask a 27-year-old to do a push-up. Just like the skill of serving, the drills used to train serving don't look very different from a 13 to a 17 to a 22-year-old, or from a 18 to a 25 to a 26-year-old. We need to look at mental training through that same lens. The second part of this answer is every year, or at least every couple years, we do our best to upgrade these workbooks and to add new activities and to add the evidence and the literature and the new science into these workbooks. This has been edited 3 times in the last 5 years. This is the first time that we've been able to really take a real comprehensive approach to volleyball and make a sports-specific version of this, thanks to our partnership with the OVA. But that would be, again, my kind of my long version of that answer. Any other questions? As I'm waiting for any last minute questions, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the link again. 1 second. I'm just going to put the link once again to the order form for the book. So for any of you who might be participating in this webinar and who currently have not ordered any books, I'm going to put it in the chat bar right now. And again, if you have any questions moving forward, please don't hesitate to send me an email or a message. I do my best to reach out. Sometimes it might be a little bit more delayed than you'd like, but I really genuinely enjoy engaging with coaches on this subject. I really enjoy helping you to figure out ways to integrate this into your efforts. And again, I do appreciate that you do have a lot on your plate and that this is largely a volunteer role for many of you. So I want to find a way to make this more simple for you so that you can be as impactful as you can be. One last question, Stephanie. Hi, Stephanie. She asked, will we be receiving an audio version of this webinar? I'll have to check in with LP on that, but my sense is that if you don't receive one by email, it'll definitely be posted on the website. So if there are no more questions, again, I really appreciate you taking the time to join in. I wish you all the best for those of you who have already ordered the workbooks. I wish you all the best in its integration and its implementation with your teams. In addition to messaging me, we have another consultant, another support that you can reach out to. Her name is Jamie Collins. She's doing the work with the provincial Team Ontario Elite teams this year. She is going to be doing their mental performance work, and she's also going to be available for some additional support with the Trainwave workbooks. So her email address, I'll put it in the chat, is jamie@Marblelabs, and mine is Kyle@Marblelabs. So thank you again, and enjoy your night. Take care.